and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The Local Government Development Ministry has come under some criticism for its decision to consult with Singapore's Housing and Development Board contractors in hope of learning best practices from the HDB model. Now, Minister Ngah Koh Meng said that learning from the successes of Singapore's HDB in providing public housing for 80% of its citizens may in fact help Malaysia tackle some of our own affordable housing issues. What can we learn about public housing from our neighbours down south? Well, joining me on the show to discuss this further is Dr. Suraya Ismail. She's Director of Research at Khazanah Research Institute. She's a member of the panel of experts for the Ministry of Housing and Local Government and a council member for both the National Cost of Living Council and National Council of Digital Economy and 4IR. Dr. Suraya, thank you for joining me on the show. What do you make of this brouhaha over consulting Singapore? I mean, should we in the first place be looking at Singapore's HDB model for our own affordable housing programs? I mean, what would you say are some of the pros and cons of doing this?
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you for having me back on your show. I think to go straight to your question, whenever someone wants to look and learn from other countries, I think it's fantastic. I think it is great that we try to learn as much as we can from other countries that are successful in the provision of housing for their own citizens. Be it from Singapore, be it from, I heard that we are going even to Hong Kong. Don't know how successful that is in terms of affordability, but there are some European countries that I think he's mentioning as well. I think what should be underwriting the motives, I think, is that this is an opportunity to come back and revisit the national housing policy, where we actually, when the government did say that we want to ensure that the housing delivery system in our country can give the sort of housing that a Malaysian population wants, which is good, decent housing quality with affordable prices. So with that objective, it is good to look at many other delivery system of other countries. Now let's go specifically to Singapore. The outcome of Singapore Housing Development Board is very good. They can house 90% of their population within the Housing Development Board provision. But you have to understand as well, you have that outcome, but what are the building blocks of that country or the characteristics of that housing industry that enables them to then come out with that outcome? First of all their land is in the state or the holdings of the government. More than 90% of land is in the holdings of the government, meaning there's no private developers, but only for 10% of the land and about 10 to 12% of the population, which is the upper tier, the most affluent of the population over there. Now, if this is something that we want to emulate for our country, then we have to nationalize all the land in our country. I don't know whether this is something we would like to do, but that will be the building blocks towards a housing provision like Singapore. And this is called a universal provision system. We don't have that here because we are also pro-market. We want our developers to also help us in the national housing delivery system. So if we just follow the housing development model, that means there's less space for our own private developers to partake in the housing delivery system. Now, that's one angle that I think we should understand. And secondly, but there are things that we can look at. We look at in terms of why Singapore model could be good in terms of maintenance. Maintenance of their HDB is excellent. I mean, their houses, they cater for both those in the social sector, which is our PPR, as well as those in the M40, because they cater for about 80% of population. So they do social housing and they do public housing. There's two different things here.
What's the difference, Dr. Suraya, if you just so that I get the terminology correct? What's the difference between social housing and public housing?
Okay, so for Singapore, not for us, for Singapore, because they embark into a universal provision system, um, up to 80% of population gets into HDB housing. Some are based on needs, meaning they can't pay the price of the cost of a unit, so there are subsidies. But there are some who can pay the rate that the HDB provides or the cost of the housing. So these are what we call public housing, housing that has market rates but provided by the state.
Okay.
So that's public housing.
Okay,
Now,
got it.
so what they have done there is that there's no financial intermediary between the government and the purchaser. There's no banks. So what they do is basically the people who buy this housing, they use their equivalent to our EPF, the CPF, to then buy these houses. At the same time, they are having a contract with the government. It's very different with us, where we have our affordable market is we have a contract with the banks. So this is a real this is the direction that the Singapore government wanted, and therefore that those houses are tied to monetize your retirement funds. So you can't leave it to a dilapidated state. Hence, why do they do very good maintenance? Is because they can't make they can't afford for their houses to be in dilapidated situation, because if not, their EPF or our what they call CPF, which is our EPF, that's where they get their money from. So
that's the asset, right?
That's the asset based, what we call asset based social security. So due to that that objective, maintenance must be very high in order for them to ensure that these houses will not fall in value, and therefore their investments will not fall in value. So this is very important.
That's right. If I just may, so what I understand is that the land acquisition is different from Malaysia, from Singapore. The financing model is very different, Malaysia and Singapore. So what is it that we can learn from HDB apart from the maintenance? Why is it that we should be consulting with their contractors? Is it something to do with the built environment, the design? Is that something we can emulate from Singapore's HDB?
Maybe that's a good point. Yes, we can look at their design, their tropical design, as well as some of their configuration of the housing. It's not just, for example, for our PPR, it's a 3-bedroom apartments only. But for them, they have 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, 5 bedrooms. But mind you, we can't really compare because they are providing for the whole of society. So we can't really compare that in that sense. And in terms of, say, for example, the urban planning as well as the design, we have ample spaces, we have land. They don't have. So for us to go up so dense, I don't see the point as much, because that will increase your maintenance cost. And maintenance cost in our context is being borne by us through the JMC, Joint Management Body, JMB.
Right.
Yes, committee.
Okay, so we have abundance of land. Singapore has land constraints, and they have to build up higher density. We may not have those similar constraints. Can I ask you, if, to put aside the Singapore HDB model then, I mean, good to consult other countries, but if we could reimagine our affordable housing for a Malaysian context with all our own conditions and constraints, how would you reimagine it?
So one of the things that I think one should really look at is, where do we draw the line between government provision and private sector provision? So that's really the case here. In my humble opinion, I think that government provision should be looking at those in abject poverty, because shelter is something that government provisioning should help. Government-assisted types of housing. Now, the problem now why government is reaching out even to the M40 is because houses provided by the private sector is too expensive, and therefore they are now trying to provision for the M40. I think this is the wrong strategy. I think we should ensure that the private sector do not have to cater for low-cost housing because that is under the provision of government. They look at the market, which is from affordable housing type of median multiple. What do I mean by affordable housing median multiple? For KRI, we don't believe in, um, government provisioning just to cater for all, but for those in need. And therefore, the private sector should have affordable range for the M40. So this follows your 3 times median multiple, whereby it will make government provisioning do not go into the private sector. So in a nutshell, 20% if following our estimation, depending on the state, 20% under government provisioning for the poor, and 80% is under the sphere of the private sector, but with some regulation that is anchored on the price, anchoring to the income of the local population.
Is it because there's no clear direction from the top, Dr. Suraya? Why is there such an overlapping cross-communication between government and private?
I think this we have to go back to history. We wanted the private sector to help in coming out with low-cost housing. But the problem with private sector coming out with low-cost housing is that low-cost housing provided by the government would have maintenance schedule done by the government. But low-cost housing by the private developer will not have that type of amenities or provision for them. So this would make low-cost housing provided by the private sector less amenable to those who are living in it now. And we are creating a lot of urban slums. Now, policy-wise, we should make sure that this practice is not done anymore. However, sometimes a benign government, we've always had that because we wanted to make sure even the M40 can afford decent housing. Now, if the private sector is not providing those decent housing with decent prices, that's when the government would want to supply more, and then this is where the problems start. So rather than do that, we should regulate some of the prices of housing so that it will match with the income of the local population. Now that's when affordable housing threshold becomes around 500,000 for a decent house. And this is when the private sector is saying that they can't afford, they can't cover this, and they want the government to help. So this is when the negotiation is still ongoing, and sometimes it's a gridlock. But I think with more clear direction on which side should the government concentrate on and which side should the private developer concentrate on, then this would be a clear indication that even for the private sector, there are assistance in terms of making sure they can go into IBS where they be more competitive. Because Singapore model, that's one thing that we should follow the Singapore model, is that they actually, the government have assisted the developers to then go into, or the contractors to go into IBS. They started in 1995. Now all the construction methods are all in IBS.
So IBS is the industrialized building system. It's okay.
Yeah. So the quality of the houses are very good because it's based on prefabrication.
Okay, well, Dr. Suraya, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I appreciate your insights. That was Dr. Suraya Ismail from Khazanah Research Institute. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. Let's continue our conversation about the Local Government Development Ministry and it coming under fire for wanting to tap the expertise of the contractors of Singapore's Housing and Development Board. But are these criticisms justified? Are there things that we can learn from Singapore? Joining me on the show now is Ko Charlie. She's the founder and CEO of Urban Metri, which is a data company that uses proprietary algorithms to analyze big data from cities. Charlie, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Now, I spoke to Dr. Soraya a little bit earlier, and she talked about the different circumstances that we have from Singapore. The way we acquire land, our financing model is completely different from the HDB flats model. But despite these differences, I'm curious to know from you, I mean, what do you make of the ministry's move to learn from the HDB experience? Should we be looking to Singapore for best practices when it comes to housing policy?
Thank you for having me on the show. I think for context, I think I would like to. I'm actually quite surprised at how far this has taken out of context. I was trained as an urban planner at MIT. So just to iterate how interesting the HDB public housing model is, all urban planners around the world, when they study public housing, they always study two cities very well, Hong Kong and Singapore, because they are known to have one of the best public housing programs globally. So any urban planner, when you talk about learning, they always learn from these two cities, on top of the other cities that we always look at in the US, which is usually a not so successful case, which we also learn from. The UK, which has hit and misses. Australia, which does very well in subsidies, and also in Japan. So all these different cities, there's plenty to learn from. And the important thing is to know what works and what did not work in those cities, right? So let us zoom back to the case of HDB. HDB is known to be very successful, primarily because of two things, but also very key difference with us. In Singapore, 80% of housing is public housing, right? We are like all the other way around. Public housing is a very minority part of the stock that actually houses our population, right? So you can already see that our definition of housing in terms of who it's for is already very different, right? Top 20% or the bottom 20%, right? That's a very key one. In Hong Kong and in Singapore, for example, they're both islands. And because they're so land constrained, there's a lot of pressure around efficiency on how they manage these resources, who they house in them, who lives in them, and the pricing of these housing, right? So it's actually quite controlled, right? Whereas if you go to the other countries, it is more about filling the gaps of the private housing market in which it is not met, right? And I would argue that in Malaysia, we are more of the latter than the former. But that said, there is still a lot of things in both Hong Kong and in Singapore that we can learn from. And we should learn from them, primarily because they are so resource constrained, and yet they could do it very well. It's because they harvest a lot of technology, right? So they count the housing really well. They know which ones are vacant, the conditions that they're in, and when you need to intervene to make sure that those resources are well managed in terms of maintenance of the building, who lives in them, is it the mixture, is it old people, too many young people, or too many families, what's incoming in the population, all those things are actually very well analyzed and very well processed, right? And it's something that maybe other countries could learn from, because sometimes we are so used to sort of like plugging the holes. We are like, oh, we discover that we don't have enough housing in this market segment. Then we go in there and then we sort of plug it. We don't forward see, we don't predict, and we don't forecast. So those are things that is very important to learn from.
So collecting data, so they're very good at knowing what the supply and demand, what the market needs, and data is crucial for that. Charlie, when we look at the specific conditions of Malaysia's affordable housing sector, what then can we take for the local context? What lessons for the local context that might fit our situation, because again, we've been doing things a certain way, plugging the holes a certain way for years now. It's not yielded much difference. What would you do differently?
Yeah, I will definitely track it better. So I was just doing a presentation earlier in the day where I highlighted how we are building affordable housing where oversupply of affordable housing where there's just everybody rushing in at a certain time frame and building it, and then other places where I don't have enough affordable housing. And we're not talking about like KLCC that's put to prima housing. That I'm not talking about it. I'm talking about some areas that are very prime are still oversupplied, and some areas that really have a strong population growth, but maybe because it's not so popular, the pricing is not so high, there is not enough interest in that location to build, or local government policies are not favorable, right? So all this sort of mismatching, I would say mismatching, is happening on the ground, and a lot of times people want a silver bullet. For example, if you look at a lot of affordable housing, either Prima or Rumah Wip or Rumah Selangorku, I can tell you 90% of the stock is 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 850 square feet. So it is almost like, oh, this is what is needed. This is what everybody needs. But actually, if you look at other countries, when they look at public housing, they look at the population graph and look at what's next. When I build it in the next 5 years, is it going to be an aging population? Do I have a lot of old people? Do I need a lot of corridors because we need to see where the old people are moving? Do we need to have senior centers next to kindergartens, next to parks, next to bus stop, and can it be walkable? Those are the things that people are talking about, neighborhoods, right? We are building neighborhoods where the housing is not just that 850 square foot, it's the corridors, it's the local neighborhood, it is where to prevent motorcycles hitting on kids, it's to prevent safety. So when we talk about public housing learning, building that community, building that social relationship, all those things are things that we can learn from, especially when we talk about high density living. There are very good examples that we can learn from, and there are examples that are not so good. So if you go to the UK, for example, we have a lot of issues with public housing, house in areas that don't have public transport. So, if you're already in the lower income group, you can't afford to have a car. So how do I access this public housing, right? So there's a lot of this kind of, they call it slum towns, that is built disposable public housing. It houses people for 15 years, people can't maintain it, then the government builds it again and again. So the total lifetime cost is a lot more than actually accessing a private house, for example, that you could have subsidized. So many, many lessons around the world, plenty of different experiments has been done. And I truly hope at the bottom of my heart that the government reach us out, right, and learn from all these either mistakes or successes, and not do a copy and paste, right? Nobody should be doing a copy and paste. Everybody should be learning what worked and what didn't work in different contexts.
Shali, can I ask you about whether government is best equipped to do this, or should it be outsourced to the private sector? Is this something that are governments good at building public housing?
Government is very good at wanting to supply public housing. The issue has always been maintaining the livability of the public housing and not having it disposable. I think ownership is quite important, or the idea of ownership. A lot of people talk about getting the lower income group better access to housing by letting them own it, right? So a simple example is this strata ownership issue. Okay, so let's say you are, I don't know, earning 6,000 ringgit. So you're definitely in the B40, okay, in Klang Valley B40. And you want to buy a house that's 150,000, okay? You can afford maybe the government or Bank Negara even gives you 110% loan. And you can afford to move in, fantastic, you own it already. You have the deed on your name. But you forget that you have to pay cukai pintu, right? Your taxes, your assessment, your maintenance, right? And all those things that come with actual ownership. So people are actually not very literate about the cost, the ongoing cost of being an owner. And then you slap on top of that in a building that maybe has 1,000 units, right? Who's going to be the JMB? Who's going to maintain my common areas? And in the Strata Management Act today, it is by volunteers. So can you imagine you are a 6,000 ringgit breadwinner, already doing 2 jobs. Are you going to sit and volunteer in your JMC to maintain my lifts, to maintain my park? So who does that? So a one-size-fits-all model doesn't quite work, right? It is about resources. How do you ongoing support the public housing resources, making sure that they are resilient, sustainable, well-maintained, and not, burden people with housing that is going to deteriorate. So
Right.
how do we learn these things from public housing overseas? Some are public funded. So maybe you learn about what kind of financial support that government can provide to these sort of housing complexes.
Charlie, thank you for sharing your insights. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. This is a topic we have to come back to again and again, I'm sure. But that was my conversation with Coach Charlie from Urban Metri, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching and good night.